Imagine being a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, faced with an unsettling task. Before you lies the pharaoh's wife on the cold marble slab, awaiting a mummification unlike any other. This decree defies sacred traditions you hold dear. The chilling truth reveals that extreme practices were a part of daily life in ancient Egypt, far beyond the golden treasures and mysterious pyramids often portrayed. Uncover the hidden legacy of sexual practices so shocking that even Victorian archaeologists sought to conceal the evidence. A world where royal children suffered unspeakable abuses, where religious celebrations transformed into chaotic orgies of violence and debauchery. Delve into the depths of Egyptian history, where intimate rituals were not mere ceremonies but wielded as tools of political power and cosmic influence. Discover a civilization where the pharaohs, revered as living gods, believed their intimate acts could sway the prosperity of the land and the very fate of their people. Explore the darker truths of Egyptian intimacy, suppressed by museums worldwide for centuries, revealing a society that pushed the boundaries of modern comprehension between 3100 BC and 30 BCE. Along the banks of the Nile, enormous pressure existed to demonstrate divine power through increasingly extreme demonstrations, temple inscriptions, papyrus documents containing explicit details unfit for public display, and archaeological findings purposely hidden by Victorian scholars offer evidence. During the 19th century, archaeologists were shocked by explicit imagery found in Egyptian tombs and temples, resulting in the destruction or seclusion of such evidence in private collections. Egyptian society viewed sexual energy as cosmic energy, where intimacy was considered a potential religious ritual. Each intimate act was seen as a conversation with the gods, and every sexual position was a form of prayer. This belief system blurred the lines between worship and intimacy, merging religious obligation with personal pleasure. However, this cosmic sexuality had a dark side. Elite children were viewed as religious possessions, while domestic slaves faced tolerated sexual exploitation. In times of crisis, such as the failure of crops, sexual practices turned increasingly desperate and brutal. The pivotal discovery occurred in 1925, not during a grand tomb excavation, but in a quiet laboratory. During the detailed examination of King Tutankhamun's mummy, the absence of the boy king's genitals was noted, surgically removed shortly after death with precision. This incident, along with similar occurrences, resonated in Egyptology for years to come, as advanced research techniques were applied to more royal mummies. A troubling revelation unfolded. Numerous pharaohs and nobles displayed indications of genital removal or alteration. Some had undergone complete castration, while others exhibited enhancements involving the use of foreign materials. The most startling finding originated from the tomb of an unnamed prince of the 18th dynasty. Not only were his genitals missing, but evidence suggested that the removal had occurred while he was still alive. Examination of the bone structure and tissue remnants indicated that this was not a punitive measure or accident, but a purposeful religious ritual. Ancient Egyptian texts began to unveil unsettling meanings, references to perfecting the deceased for the afterlife, descriptions of readying the body for perpetual service to the gods, and instructions for altering the departed to ensure their spiritual efficacy in the next realm. The implications were profound. If the Egyptians habitually altered the genitalia of the deceased, what did this reveal about their views on human sexuality? Were these modifications restricted to post-mortem practices, or were they indicative of procedures performed on the living as well? Yet, most disconcerting of all was the systematic concealment of this evidence by Victorian archaeologists. Upon encountering explicit sexual depictions or signs of genital modification, early Egyptologists did not merely overlook them. They actively suppressed such findings, withholding artifacts from public display and expunging them from official records. For more than a century, the authentic scope of Egyptian sexual customs has been veiled not by ancient secrecy, but by contemporary shame and Victorian prudishness that were unwilling to acknowledge the irrefutable evidence. Archaeologists made a startling discovery as they uncovered not just missing genitals, but a deeper, more troubling reality in ancient Egypt. The society operated under a rigid sexual hierarchy, where the intimate lives of its citizens were tightly controlled. Essential to the nation's well-being were the pharaohs, whose sexual prowess was revered as necessary for Egypt's success. Beneath them, nobles and priests were under immense pressure to demonstrate their worth through sexual acts and religious fervor. At the lowest rung were domestic slaves, especially children, who endured systematic mistreatment that was not simply accepted but mandated by religious beliefs. Children born into royal families faced a grim destiny. Texts from ancient Egypt recount how elite households would devote their youngest offspring to temple service, where they were instructed in sexual practices from a young age. These children, some as young as 6 or 7, were educated that their bodies were not their own but belonged to the gods. Their training was rigorous and harsh. They were taught specific postures, methods to prolong pleasure, and tactics to stay aroused during lengthy religious rituals. They were conditioned to detach from their physical sensations, regarding their bodies as tools rather than personal possessions. Medical texts highlighted the toll this training exacted on young bodies. Children suffered chronic injuries from intense flexibility training, and their growth was stunted due to malnutrition meant to retain the childlike proportions preferred by their adult patrons. Many perished from internal injuries or infections resulting from premature sexual encounters. The abuse did not end with temple training. Affluent Egyptian families frequently exploited their domestic slaves for pleasure, with children prized for their perceived purity and pliability. Legal records indicate that child slaves were commodified for sexual purposes, with their worth determined by their age, appearance, and training. The impact on survivors was profound. Adults who made it through showed signs of severe trauma recognizable to present-day psychologists. They struggled to build healthy relationships, often exhibited sexually compulsive behaviors, or withdrew completely, and tragically passed away prematurely, euphemistically referred to in ancient texts as succumbing to broken hearts. What made this even more unsettling was the way this abuse was justified using religious beliefs. Priests indoctrinated the idea that serving the gods sexually was the ultimate act of worship. They portrayed the children chosen for this service as blessed rather than exploited. Families were persuaded to feel privileged when their children were picked for temple duties, despite the underlying truth of what awaited them. The economic aspect added another layer of terror. Evidence from archaeology reveals a shocking 73% mortality rate among temple children, with medical examinations unveiling procedures lasting up to 6 hours. Affluent patrons paid exorbitant prices to access child slaves, perpetuating a systematic cycle of abuse that spanned centuries. Despite the horrors faced by Egyptian children, the Feast of Drunkenness emerged as the apex of atrocities during the country's notorious religious celebrations. What follows next is so extreme that early archaeologists, upon discovering evidence, opted to incinerate the documents rather than disclose them to the public. Prepare yourself for what comes next, as it surpasses everything you've heard. The ensuing practices intertwine religious reverence with sexual violence on a scale so shocking that even modern audiences would recoil. It entailed an entire society plunging into week-long periods of debauchery. Verified by archaeological findings that mirror the accounts provided in ancient sources, before we delve into the most unsettling part, go ahead and hit the like button if you feel ready for what's ahead, and be sure to drop a comment below sharing where you're tuning in from. It's quite fascinating how people worldwide share a common curiosity about the darkest chapters of human history. The Festival of Drunkenness marked the height of Egyptian sexual radicalism, an annual event devoted to the goddess Hathor that turned the entire society into a week-long eruption of violence, sexuality, and religious disarray. What began as an honoring of divine femininity spiraled into an act that by today's standards would be deemed a grave crime against humanity. The festival's roots can be traced back to Egyptian mythology, particularly the tale of Sekhmet, the lioness deity who nearly wiped out humankind in a drunken frenzy. As the legend goes, the gods had to flood Egypt with beer, tinged with red ochre, to trick Sekhmet into thinking she was consuming blood, leading her to get so intoxicated that she abandoned her murderous intent and transformed into the Tamar Hathor. This myth formed the basis for an annual revelry that encouraged every Egyptian to drink to the point of divine possession. However, the festival transcended mere intoxication. Participants believed that when inebriated, they embodied vessels for the deities themselves, granting them freedom to act on any impulse without ethical or legal repercussions. Months before the event, temple officials would concoct large quantities of beer, often infused with psychoactive compounds sourced from lotus flowers and other plants. This brew didn't just intoxicate tea-induced hallucinations and significantly diminished inhibitions. Attendees reported seeing visions, hearing divine messages, and feeling overtaken by supernatural powers. When the festival commenced, all societal norms vanished. Masters engaged in sexual acts with slaves openly in public squares. Married women forsaked their families to join wandering groups of merrymakers. Children were exposed to explicit, intimate behaviors and often became participants themselves. The entire society plunged into disorder that endured for 7 days and nights. Ancient writings depict scenes that would shock even present-day readers. Intoxicated groups of Egyptians would rampage through cities, breaking into homes and compelling inhabitants to partake in their festivities. Women endured collective mistreatment under the guise of religious communion. Men vied to prove their ability to sustain sexual arousal for extended periods while inebriated. The brutality matched the intensity of the promiscuity. Participants would assault one another with sexual fervor, resorting to biting, scratching, and inflicting wounds believed to be divine blessings. Some celebrants perished from internal injuries sustained during violent sexual encounters. Others were trampled by throngs of intoxicated revelers traversing narrow streets. The religious rationalization heightened the disturbing nature of the events. Priests indoctrinated that any actions taken during the festival were inherently sacred. As participants were possessed by divine entities, abuse was framed as a form of religious communion, violence as a sacred offering, and child exploitation as a divine benediction. Foreign observers recorded international dismay at these revelries. Mesopotamian envoys branded the festival as evidence that Egyptians were uncivilized barbarians masquerading as a sophisticated society. Certain kingdoms abstained from sending representatives to Egypt during festival periods, fearing for their well-being and moral integrity. The aftermath of the festival was as harrowing as the event itself. Participants frequently had no recollection of their actions, while under the influence, leading to emotional distress upon discovering evidence of their behavior. Families were torn apart as members uncovered the deeds of their loved ones during the festivities. Offspring born 9 months after the event endured societal stigma, being viewed as products of divine possession rather than conventional conception. The economic repercussions were significant. Entire cities would come to a standstill for a week as the populace engaged in intoxicated revelry. Agricultural activities ceased, trade halted, and governmental operations ground to a halt. The lost productivity was substantial, but pharaohs deemed it a necessary cost to preserve cosmic equilibrium. Moreover, the festival served political objectives, acting as a pressure release valve for social unrest. It enabled the Egyptian social structure to uphold a strict hierarchy for the majority of the year. Citizens could challenge authority, slaves could shame their masters, and societal norms could be flouted, but only within this tightly regulated period of disorder. Archaeological findings validate the extreme nature of these celebrations. Excavations at temple sites unearthed chambers specifically designed for collective sexual activities, exhibiting elements indicating their use for violent and debasing acts. Physical evidence aligns with the unsettling records chronicled by ancient writers. The gradual decline of Egyptian sexual customs commenced during the Ptolemaic era, when Greek rulers endeavored to enforce Mediterranean values on Egyptian religious traditions. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism triggered a crisis that ultimately dismantled both systems. Despite being foreign rulers, the Ptolemies found it necessary to partake in Egyptian religious festivals to maintain credibility among their subjects. The extreme sexual practices encountered by foreigners horrified those with Greek sensibilities. Cleopatra I tried to reform the excessive festival of drunkenness by shortening its duration and imposing restrictions on violence and public displays of sexuality. These changes caused a religious crisis, as Egyptian priests warned that altering the festivities would enrage the gods, leading to catastrophic consequences. They cited natural calamities, military losses, and economic troubles as signs of divine displeasure with foreign interference in sacred rituals. The crisis peaked under Cleopatra III, who struggled to reconcile Egyptian religious traditions with Roman political pressures. Romans were scandalized by the Egyptian sexual customs, considering them indicators of barbarism and moral decline. However, Egyptian priests threatened revolt if the traditional festivals were completely abolished. Cleopatra's resolution was to organize private versions of the celebrations for Egyptian religious leaders, while portraying a more restrained image to Roman spectators. This compromise failed to satisfy either side, fostering a culture of deceit that eroded both Egyptian religious authority and Roman political influence. The mistreatment of children became more widespread during this era, as rulers sought to demonstrate their commitment to Egyptian practices while concealing the atrocities from Roman authorities. Child slaves were increasingly trafficked, their abuse carried out in concealed chambers inaccessible to Roman officials. The societal impact on Egypt was profound, with generations of children raised in an environment normalizing sexual violence and religious extremism. When external pressure compelled changes to these practices, many Egyptians experienced a form of cultural trauma. They did not just lose their religious traditions, but also their entire framework for understanding sexuality and divine connection. The ultimate downfall occurred with the Roman invasion in 30 BCE, shocked by the discoveries made in Egyptian temples. Augustus Caesar immediately decreed the suppression of sexual religious customs. Roman soldiers obliterated explicit artworks, incinerated religious manuscripts, and executed priests who refused to forego traditional rituals. The Romans did not merely suppress Egyptian sexual practices, they meticulously obliterated any trace of their existence. Temples were stripped of explicit adornments, scrolls detailing sexual rites were set ablaze, and architectural elements linked to religious sexuality were either destroyed or concealed. The children ensnared in this system suffered a particularly tragic destiny. Many had been conditioned so deeply for sexual servitude that adapting to a normal life became insurmountable. Roman archives recount former temple youths ending their own lives. Rather than confront a world where their sole perceived worth had been eradicated, the survivors bore the burden of trauma that plagued Egyptian society for generations. The entrenched sexual abuse gave rise to behavioral and belief patterns not easily effaced by political subjugation. Roman officials reported persistent issues with subterranean sexual cults, networks involved in child trafficking, and clandestine religious movements striving to revive traditional practices. Despite their efforts, the Romans could not obliterate all traces of evidence. What they left behind would astonish Victorian archaeologists sufficiently to initiate the most extensive cover-up in archaeological annals. The systematic concealment of Egyptian sexual practices did not originate from ancient clandestine schemes, but rather from Victorian moral sensibilities, unable to reconcile with the archaeological truths revealed. In the 19th century, when explorers first encountered explicit sexual images in Egyptian tombs and temples, it triggered a cultural crisis that significantly influenced Egyptology for the following 150 years. This trend began early on, seen when Giovanni Belzoni in 1817 found sexually explicit wall paintings in CS tomb and chose to cover them with plaster rather than make records of them. In his writings, Belzoni described the tomb as featuring stunning religious scenes, conveniently omitting the explicit sexual depictions found in multiple chambers. This approach became customary during the Victorian era. Auguste Merritt, the creator of the Egyptian Antiquity Service, maintained private collections of explicit artifacts that were kept away from public view. As the Egyptian Museum in Cairo emerged, certain types of artifacts were segregated into restricted storage areas accessible only to male academics. The censorship extended beyond imagery. Victorian translators routinely sanitized sexual content from ancient texts, either by using euphemisms to replace explicit descriptions or by omitting portions entirely. The renowned Ires's Papyrus, a vital medical text from ancient Egypt, contained over 40 sections on sexual practices that weren't translated until the 1970s. Particularly alarming was the deliberate destruction of evidence. The British archaeologist Flender Petrie openly confessed to destroying artifacts he deemed too indecent for public eyes. His records documented burning papyri, shattering statues, and burying relics depicting sexual acts he deemed unsuitable for documentation. The cover-up extended into the realm of academia. Universities declined to finance research on Egyptian sexuality, deeming it unsuitable for scholarly investigation. Students showing interest in these topics faced discouragement or expulsion. Academic journals have consistently declined papers addressing sexual practices, even when supported by robust archaeological evidence. Museums have devised complex schemes to conceal artifacts linked to sexuality. For instance, the British Museum possesses more than 2,800 Egyptian artifacts clandestinely stored in restricted access areas, camouflaged as miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects. As recent as 2019, the Louvre was caught concealing newly unearthed papyri from public view. Wikipedia articles discussing these subjects are inexplicably locked for editing. Visitors keen on viewing these items encounter bureaucratic hurdles meant to deter casual curiosity. Similarly, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York enforces comparable constraints. Their Egyptian exhibits showcase sanitized versions of tomb paintings with explicit sexual depictions, either covered or digitally edited. The original artwork is kept in storage, solely accessible to researchers, demonstrating a genuine academic necessity and agreeing to stringent confidentiality protocols. This Victorian-era legacy still shapes contemporary understanding of ancient Egypt. Mainstream documentaries and museum displays predominantly highlight political history, religious beliefs, and artistic accomplishments, neglecting the core significance of sexual practices in Egyptian society. This sanitized version of history deviates significantly from the intricate and often unsettling reality of life in ancient Egypt. This persistent concealment has led to considerable knowledge gaps concerning human sexuality, religious customs, and societal structures within one of history's most impactful civilizations. The secrets concealed in Egyptian tombs and texts expose how religious reverence can evolve into systemic exploitation when human sexuality is manipulated for cosmic authority. For 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization endorsed practices where children were treated as sexual possessions. Violence was normalized as a form of religious homage, and intimacy was wielded as a tool for political supremacy. If this glimpse into the obscure darkness of history has piqued your curiosity for more hidden truths, I've curated another journey into the shadows of the past that promises to be equally riveting. Click on the video displayed on your screen now to uncover another astonishing chapter that history attempted to suppress. And if this exploration resonated with you as much as it did with me, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so we can further unveil the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be acknowledged, and countless untold stories are waiting to be shared.